It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show, only on Secular Media Network.
Well, hello everybody and welcome back. This is Phil Ferguson and you are listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. This is show number 158. It is February of 2016, and a little bit later in the show we will talk to Liz Liddell. She is the executive director of the Reason Rally. Special secret announcements. This is the first podcast to have this information, in part because I'm on the board of directors, and in part because Liz is being really nice and coming on the Phil Ferguson Show. So hang on for that. You are going to be amazed at some of the speakers and events that are being scheduled, and we're going to go through all of that detail just a little bit later in the show. And after that, we are going to blow your mind with a special recording I made with the gentlemen of the podcast Cognitive Dissonance. They are based in Chicago, and I'd like to say they're friends of mine, but they're not. Just kidding. Anyway, I happened to be going to Chicago to pick up my daughter when she came back from Brazil a few weeks ago, and I swung by their studio. Oh, the stories that those rooms could tell, the building that they're in. We'll talk about that a little bit. It just kind of starts because I didn't know they'd started recording, and it was so fun and hysterical that I'm just going to put the whole damn thing into the show. So it'll just start. So enjoy, and of course, go check out their show. And before we get into all of that, just a little bit of update here on my end. Was just going through some of the recent things, and there's no end to the stupid things, but the one that just really caught my eye because it's regional, it's in St. Louis, Missouri, the St. Louis Archbishop. Now keep in mind, this is the same Archbishop that testified that he wasn't aware that raping children was a crime. So this is the caliber of person we're dealing with, that they think that is a reasonable solution. And quite frankly, I'm concerned that if Archbishop of the Catholic Church doesn't know that raping a child is a problem or a crime, then obviously what good is the organization? None, as you may have guessed, is my opinion. But he's now come out against the Girl Scouts, and talks about how they teach women to be feminists and to refuse to play their role in the godly world of succumbing to men. And they teach them, the Girl Scouts teach girls about birth control and lesbianism and all this terrible stuff. So this is my call to you. It's time to go buy more Girl Scout cookies. Yes, that's right. So get some more Thin Mints and celebrate an organization that is not tied to religion and that is helping to educate and show the world to young adults. If only the Boy Scouts could follow the lead of the Girl Scouts, but that's for another show perhaps. The other fun thing I did want to talk about, it's something that I've talked about before, the importance of performance and how much it can mean or hurt your long-term returns. Well, as you can imagine, one of my listeners wrote in and said, Phil, how much can it hurt my long-term returns? And it just so happens that in my talk that I do to different groups called Investing Skeptically, how to avoid getting ripped off in the stock market, I happen to have done this, so I'm going to share some of this information with you. I'm going to keep it a little short today because last week was all about investing, and this week we've got the Cognitive Dissonance and Liz talking about the Reason Rally. So we're just going to do this. The long-term market returns are around 10%, U.S. stock market. You can argue that. You can argue it's 10.4. You can argue it's 10.2. You can argue it's 11 or even 9, depending on how you want to slice it. But it's around 10 based on the S&P 500, and you can go look this up yourself on Wikipedia. It's 10.47% compounded average growth rate over the last 46, 47 years. So I'll call it 10, just to be conservative. The average mutual fund underperforms the market about 2 to 2.2 to 2.4%. And part of the reason is that the vast majority of people listening to this podcast, my own money is in mutual funds. Mutual funds as a collective cannot beat the market because they kind of are the market. So they match the market minus their expenses. And those expenses don't just include the expense ratio. They include front-end loads, back-end loads, 12B1 fees, and, of course, all of the trading costs that a mutual fund incurs when they do rapidly trading to try to beat the market. You pay for all of that. They don't absorb that. They still get paid their amount. But you know what? Let's be conservative and call that only 2%. So your average return of being 10 is 2%. One of the other things I've talked about before is that, basic philosophy, buy low, sell high, buy and hold. Human beings have really hard times following those very simple rules. As an example, the average investor, whether by choice or by force, generally switches out their mutual funds every 3 to 5 years. Often it's because they switch jobs. Sometimes it's because their employer changes the 401k plan that they have. And what tends to happen is we look as a society, we look in the magazines or online or newspapers, and we want to buy the funds that have done really well over the last 3 to 5 years. The ironic thing is not only do they not predict how well they're going to do, it's almost the opposite. There is a process called regression to the mean. So the funds that you buy, if they've done really, really well over the last 3 to 5 years, are likely to now underperform the market. Things go in cycles. And it's one of those things that people will come to me from time to time and say, hey, Phil, this advisor has made this portfolio that over the last 5 years has made 18%, but the market has only made 15%. And they ask if I can do better. I said, well, of course I can do better. I've got a database with 40,000 different mutual funds. And if I pick the right handful of funds that have done well in the last 5 years, I can build you a portfolio that will return you not 18, but 20, 21, 22, maybe even 25%. Will you get that going forward? Probably not. I would reasonably expect that you will not make that money going forward because it's unrealistic, and you'll probably actually underperform the market. So again, you're better off in the index funds. But the expense and the cost that happens is what happens is people buy hot funds, and so they've made the great returns, and then they underperform. And when they underperform, you sell them. Now, so you're selling low and you're buying high in relationship to the market overall. That costs the average investor another 2.3%. So we've gone from 10 to 8 to 5.7. And assuming you're not in an index fund, that you're just in a regularly traded mutual fund that buys and sells stocks because their goal is to try to figure out how to beat the market. As we know, collectively they cannot. But just like the average person thinks they're better than average driver, most mutual funds think they can beat the market, so they try to, and their behavior results in the vast majority of the returns being taxable in the short run at your higher tax rate. If you make a lot of money, 3, 4, 5, 800,000, you can lose up to 40 to 50% of your money every single year because the funds do a lot of trading. If you are in an index fund, you will pay ordinary income tax on the dividends. No way around that, at least in a taxable account. But the other part, you will pay a maximum of 20% capital gains rate, but only when you sell. So you will have the advantage of compounding year after year in the stock investments as if you owned individual stocks, and you will pay 20% capital gains only when you sell. It's so phenomenally important. But if you pay taxes in an average fund of 25%, you go from 5.7% return to 4.3. So 4.3 is what the average person tends to get in a taxable account when the market goes up 10. There's a big difference. It's slightly less than half the return. Unfortunately, we live in a linear world. When you buy things, you pay a certain dollar amount. You hand them cash unless you charge it. They give you change. It's addition and subtraction. We don't normally think about compounding. So I wanted to give you an example of just how amazing this difference is over a longer period of time. And I'm going to look at 30 years of time. And so if you start with $10,000 and you make a 10% return every single year, no taxes, you're in an untaxable account. Let's just start with that. Your $10,000 with no additional money could turn into $174,000. It's a lot of money. Well, that's 30 years is a long time, but that's the power of compound interest. However, if you make only 8%, because you have average mutual funds that have expenses, high expenses, 2% or higher, I'm only putting in 2% at this point. Your return drops from $174,000 down to $100,000. You lose $74,000 over 30 years because of the higher expenses. If we then include the concept that you change mutual funds, whether you meant to or you chose to or you're doing some research, it's counterproductive and your results drop to $53,000. And if you include taxes, your results could be $35,000. So you end up with about 1/5 of the money in the long run when your performance was slightly below 1/2. That's one of the powers of compounding. So just something to think about. Avoid costs. Use index funds. If all of that makes sense to you, go forth and prosper. If you have any questions, want follow-up information, or want to talk to me, you can email me, Phil@Polaris Financial Planning. Please do include your telephone number because I want to call you and talk to you. Talking about very complicated information about finance and investing over emails is not something I'm good at, nor do I like to do it. But I will ask you, because a few people have done this in the past and again in the last couple of weeks, do not send me documents the first time you email me. I do get statements, I get Social Security numbers, I get tax numbers. If we decide to work together, we'll get to that point and I'll collect that information. But don't start with that. Don't send that to an email address you've not even verified it's really to me. So anyway, I'll just wrap up again. Phil@Polaris Financial Planning. What we'll do is we'll take a quick little break. We'll come back and talk to Liz Liddell about the Reason Rally. We'll take just a minute after that, and then we'll talk to the guys from Cognitive Dissonance, and hopefully you enjoy the show.
Here's an excerpt from Nailed by David Fitzgerald.
Didn't there have to have been a Jesus? Perhaps he was just a wandering teacher or an exorcist, an apocalyptic prophet or a zealot who opposed the Romans. Perhaps he was all these things, or even a composite of several such early first-century figures. But at any rate, surely there had to be somebody at the original core of Christianity, arguably the most famous individual in human history. All this seems to be a perfectly reasonable, completely natural assumption to make, so why would anyone be so foolish as to propose that Jesus never existed? Doesn't it just make more sense to assume that there was a historical Jesus, even if we're unable to recover the real facts about his life and death? As it turns out, no. The opposite is true. The closer we look at the evidence for Jesus, the less solid evidence we find, and the more we find suspicious silences and curious resemblances to the pagan and Jewish religious ideas and philosophies that preceded Christianity. And once you begin to parse out the origins of this tradition or that teaching from their various sources, the sweater begins unraveling quickly until it becomes very difficult to buy that there ever was, or even could have been, any historical figure at the center.
Nailed by David Fitzgerald is now available at atheistaudiobooks.com.
All right, everybody, welcome back. And as promised earlier, I have Liz Liddell, who was on our show, I guess a couple of months ago, or at least many weeks ago. She is the executive director for the Reason Rally, and she has agreed to join us for a very special set of announcements. Some of this, and Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, it's brand new information just put up on the website within hours, and you have not been on any other podcast to share this news yet.
That is correct. You're getting the breaking news right here.
All right, everybody. So sit back, get your pen and pencil ready. If you're driving, pause, pull over, do whatever you've got to do. And Liz is going to give us some announcements.